anamorphic to market, but your options are still pretty limited. But what I'm finding is the interesting thing about the way the anamorphic lens covers the sensor, especially since in anamorphic you're going to be in a 2.4 aspect ratio, the Super 35 anamorphics that I've tested on the LF have actually covered the sensor pretty well. So having said all of that, really what I think the question should be is, honestly, what lenses can't you use on the camera? Now, I've actually talked to a surprising number of people who think that their Super 35 lenses are useless on a full frame camera, and that all the lenses that they've grown to love, or even maybe that they own, won't work with the new full frame cameras. But honestly, there's a few options. Now, obviously, if you're going to put Super 35 lenses on a large format camera, there's going to be some limitations and some compromises. The question then is, are those compromises and limitations acceptable for your particular project? And they might be. So one way you can use Super 35 lenses on a full frame sensor is with an expander. Now, if you don't know what that is, an expander is basically another optical element that goes between your lens and the sensor. And what it does is it takes the image circle of your lens and expands it so that it fills a bigger circle and projects a bigger image onto the sensor.
Yes, science!
Now, of course, when you're using an expander, there are some compromises, both in focal length and light loss. So for example, if you're using the 1.6 times expander from Tokina, there is a one-stop light loss, as well as all of your focal lengths are now going to be 1.6 times longer. Now again, those are compromises that may or may not be crucial to your particular project. I always personally got hung up on losing a stop of light. I want the shallow depth of field as I can get, right? And if I'm losing a stop of light, how am I going to get that? But then, of course, what I realized is a full frame sensor is more sensitive to light and has a shallower depth of field. So a one-stop loss in light really isn't that big of a deal. Now, I don't claim to know how all the math works. I've read through discussions on how depth of field is calculated, and it depends, of course, on the two exact sensors that you're comparing, and it's a long, intense calculation. But basically what it boils down to, once you follow the equation all the way to the end, is the difference between a full frame sensor and a Super 35 sensor is about a stop and a third, more or less.
It's science.
So what that means is, for example, if you're at a T4 on a full frame sensor, you're going to get the equivalent depth of field of a 2.8 on a Super 35 sensor. Now, of course, that's not exactly exact, but for me, it's close enough to give me a reference so I can compare the two. A few weeks ago, I needed to shoot an interview. Now, this is for a personal project, so all the budget was coming out of my own pocket. And, thanks to COVID-19, that meant I had zero budget whatsoever. In fact, if I didn't already own the camera, I probably wouldn't have done the shoot at all. So I went to the rental house to kind of see what my options were. I'm looking for something cheap, something available, something, it didn't have to be the most amazing lens. I just needed to be able to put something on the camera and grab a quick interview. And what I came up with was the Sigma Cine Zooms. And that's just purely based on budget and what was available at the rental house. The Sigma Cine Primes, of course, cover full frame, like I mentioned before. But the Cine Zooms are only Super 35. So what am I supposed to do? Well, the Mini LF, as it happens, actually has a couple of different sensor modes